In the marble corridors of Ashworth Palace, where whispers carry more weight than laws and a single glance can destroy careers, 12-year-old Prince Alexander had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of royal protocol with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. But on this rain-soaked Tuesday morning, in November, as he stood in the grand reception hall watching his stepmother Queen Isabella approach with that familiar cold smile that never reached her eyes, something inside him snapped. The ornate golden walls that had witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies were about to witness something unprecedented, a young prince's refusal to bow to power, a moment that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy and change the course of his life forever. What started as a simple royal engagement would spiral into a scandal that would dominate headlines, fracture relationships, and force a nation to question everything they thought they knew about their beloved royal family. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of Ashworth Palace, casting colorful shadows across the polished marble floor where Prince Alexander stood adjusting his formal military jacket. At 12 years old, he had already mastered the art of looking composed while his mind raced with 1,000 different thoughts. Today marked the 3rd anniversary of his father King William's marriage to Queen Isabella, and the palace buzzed with preparation for the ceremonial reception that would host dignitaries from across Europe. Alexander's fingers trembled slightly as he fastened the brass buttons of his jacket, each one engraved with the royal family crest. The weight of expectation sat heavy on his young shoulders, much like the ceremonial sword that hung at his side. He had been preparing for this day for weeks, memorizing the names and titles of every guest who would attend, practicing his formal greetings in 3 different languages, and rehearsing the precise timing of each bow and curtsy required by centuries-old protocol. The grand reception hall stretched before him like a cathedral of power, its vaulted ceilings decorated with intricate frescoes depicting the glorious victories of his ancestors. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, their light reflecting off the golden fixtures that adorned every surface. Portraits of previous kings and queens gazed down from gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to judge every movement, every gesture, every breath taken within these sacred walls. Alexander's personal valet, James, approached with measured steps, his polished shoes clicking against the marble with military precision. James had served the royal family for over 30 years, beginning his career when Alexander's grandfather still ruled the kingdom. His weathered face bore the marks of countless state functions, diplomatic crises, and family dramas that had unfolded within these walls. "Your Royal Highness," James said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "the Queen has requested your presence in the blue drawing room before the reception begins." A chill ran down Alexander's spine at the mention of Queen Isabella. Their relationship had been complicated from the moment she married his father 3 years ago. He was only 15 years older than Alexander himself, a former ambassador's daughter who had captivated the king during a state visit to the neighboring kingdom of Valdoria. Beautiful, intelligent, and politically astute, she had seamlessly integrated herself into royal life, but her relationship with Alexander remained distant and formal. The blue drawing room served as Queen Isabella's private receiving chamber, decorated in rich sapphire velvet and adorned with priceless artifacts from around the world. As Alexander entered, he found her standing by the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens, where groundskeepers worked diligently to ensure every flower bed met her exacting standards. Queen Isabella turned as he entered, her emerald green gown rustling softly against the Persian carpet. Her dark hair was pulled back into an elegant chignon, secured with a diamond tiara that had belonged to Alexander's grandmother. Despite her youth, she carried herself with an authority that commanded respect from everyone around her, including seasoned diplomats and military officers who had served the crown for decades. "Alexander," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent of her homeland, "I trust you understand the importance of today's ceremony." "Yes, Your Majesty," Alexander replied, executing a formal bow with practiced precision. Queen Isabella's green eyes studied him carefully, as if searching for any sign of weakness or uncertainty. "The ambassador from Nordland will be attending with his family, including his son Prince Henrik, who is approximately your age. I expect you to make a favorable impression, as this could strengthen our diplomatic ties significantly." Alexander nodded, though something in her tone made him uneasy. Queen Isabella had a way of making even simple requests sound like commands, and her political maneuvering often put him in uncomfortable positions. She seemed to view him not as her stepson, but as a chess piece to be moved strategically across the board of international diplomacy. "There is something else," she continued, walking closer until she stood directly in front of him. "Your father has asked me to ensure that you understand your role in today's proceedings. You will stand beside me during the formal presentations, and you will participate in the traditional toast to our allied nations. This request surprised Alexander. Traditionally, he would stand with his father during such ceremonies, as protocol dictated that the heir apparent should be positioned next to the reigning monarch. Queen Isabella's request represented a departure from established tradition, and Alexander felt certain his father had not actually made such a request. "Your Majesty," Alexander said carefully, "I believe protocol requires that I stand with my father during formal presentations." Queen Isabella's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift that Alexander had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "Protocol," she said slowly, "serves the crown, not the other way around. Today's ceremony requires flexibility, and I am instructing you to stand beside me." The tension in the room grew thick as Alexander considered his options. To openly defy Queen Isabella would create a scene that could embarrass the royal family in front of international dignitaries. However, abandoning his traditional position beside his father felt like a betrayal of everything he had been taught about royal duty and succession. Before Alexander could respond, the heavy oak doors of the blue drawing room opened, and Captain Marcus Thornton entered with quick, purposeful strides. Captain Thornton served as head of the Royal Guard, a position he had held for over a decade. His presence commanded immediate attention, and his dark uniform bore the gold insignia that marked him as one of the most trusted protectors of the royal family. "Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness," Captain Thornton said, bowing respectfully to both Queen Isabella and Alexander, "I apologize for the interruption, but there has been a change in today's security arrangements that requires immediate attention." Queen Isabella's eyebrows rose slightly, a sign of her displeasure at being interrupted during what she clearly considered a private conversation with her stepson.
"What sort of change?"
"Captain, intelligence reports suggest potential disruption from anti-monarchy protesters who may attempt to breach the palace grounds during today's ceremony," Captain Thornton explained. "As a precautionary measure, I recommend that Prince Alexander remain closer to the main security detail, which will be positioned near His Majesty the King." Alexander felt a wave of relief wash over him. Captain Thornton's security concerns provided a legitimate reason to maintain traditional protocol without directly challenging Queen Isabella's authority. However, the Queen's reaction suggested she viewed this development as an unwelcome complication to her plans. "I see," Queen Isabella said coldly. "And who authorized these changes to the security arrangements?" "His Majesty the King, Your Majesty," Captain Thornton replied without hesitation. "He has requested that Prince Alexander remain within close proximity to the primary security perimeter throughout today's events." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken tension. Queen Isabella's political instincts clearly told her that arguing with security recommendations would be unwise, particularly when those recommendations came directly from the king. However, Alexander could see the frustration building behind her carefully composed facade. "Very well," she said finally. "Prince Alexander will follow security protocols as directed by His Majesty." Alexander breathed a quiet sigh of relief. But his comfort was short-lived as Captain Thornton turned to leave. Queen Isabella called out to stop him. "Captain," she said, her voice taking on a tone that made Alexander's stomach tighten with apprehension, "I trust that these security measures will not interfere with Prince Alexander's other duties today." "Other duties, Your Majesty?" Captain Thornton asked. Queen Isabella's smile returned, but it carried a sharp edge that made Alexander distinctly uncomfortable. "Prince Alexander has graciously agreed to escort Ambassador Nordland's daughter during the garden reception that follows today's ceremony. This engagement has been arranged for several weeks and carries significant diplomatic importance." This was the first Alexander had heard of any such arrangement, and the surprise must have shown on his face because Captain Thornton glanced at him with a questioning look. Alexander realized that Queen Isabella was maneuvering him into a commitment he had never agreed to, using the presence of the head of security as a witness to make withdrawal difficult. "Your Majesty," Alexander said carefully, "I don't recall agreeing to escort anyone during today's events." Queen Isabella's expression remained pleasant, but her eyes flashed with warning. "Perhaps you misunderstood, Alexander. This arrangement was discussed with your father last week, and he expressed his approval. Surely you wouldn't want to disappoint our diplomatic guests or embarrass the royal family." Alexander felt trapped between maintaining diplomatic relations and standing up for himself. Queen Isabella's ability to frame personal manipulation as royal duty had become a familiar pattern, but this time felt different. Something in her demeanor suggested that today's events carried more significance than a simple anniversary celebration. Captain Thornton seemed to sense the undercurrent of tension, and his protective instincts toward Alexander became apparent in his careful response. "Your Majesty, if Prince Alexander has existing commitments that require his attention, perhaps alternative arrangements could be made for the diplomatic escort duties." "That won't be necessary," Queen Isabella said firmly. Prince Alexander understands his responsibilities to the crown. The weight of expectation, manipulation, and conflicting loyalties pressed down on Alexander's shoulders like a physical force. He looked between Queen Isabella's expectant face and Captain Thornton's concerned expression, realizing that this moment represented more than just a disagreement about ceremonial protocol. It was a test of his ability to navigate the complex political currents that swirled constantly around the royal family. Outside the windows of the blue drawing room, Alexander could hear the sounds of final preparations for the day's ceremony. Staff members hurried across the courtyard, carrying flower arrangements and adjusting decorative banners. Military personnel took their positions along the processional route, their polished uniforms gleaming in the morning sunlight. The machinery of royal pageantry moved forward with clockwork precision, but Alexander felt increasingly like a small gear that was about to jam the entire mechanism. As the minutes ticked toward the ceremony's beginning, Alexander realized that today would test not only his ability to fulfill royal obligations, but also his capacity to remain true to himself while navigating the treacherous waters of palace politics. The decisions he made in the coming hours would ripple through the royal family and beyond, affecting relationships, reputations, and the very nature of his future role within the monarchy. The grand reception hall had transformed into a spectacular display of royal splendor by the time the first guests began arriving. Hundreds of candles flickered in crystal sconces along the walls, their warm light dancing across the intricate tapestries that depicted scenes from the kingdom's most glorious military victories. The royal orchestra, positioned in the magnificent gallery that overlooked the main floor, tuned their instruments with the precision of master craftsmen preparing for the performance of their lives. Alexander stood near the entrance alongside his father, King William, whose presence commanded respect from every person in the room. The king wore his full ceremonial uniform, adorned with medals and ribbons that told the story of his reign, through symbols of peace treaties, charitable works, and diplomatic achievements. His graying beard was meticulously groomed, and his steel blue eyes surveyed the gathering crowd with the practiced assessment of a ruler who had learned to read political undercurrents in every social interaction. "Remember, Alexander," King William said quietly, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, "today's ceremony celebrates not just my marriage to Isabella, but also the strengthening of our international alliances. Every conversation, every greeting, every gesture carries weight beyond what might seem apparent on the surface." Alexander nodded, though his attention was divided between his father's words and his awareness of Queen Isabella's presence across the room. She stood near the ornate fireplace, engaging in animated conversation with the ambassador from Eastdale and his wife, her laughter carrying across the space with the musical quality that had first captivated his father. Yet Alexander noticed how her eyes occasionally flicked in his direction, as if monitoring his compliance with the arrangements she had outlined earlier. The first major diplomatic party to arrive was the delegation from Nordland, led by Ambassador Erik Nordstrom, a distinguished gentleman whose silver hair and weathered face spoke of decades spent in international service. His wife, Ambassador Lady Nordstrom, carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to high-level diplomatic circles. Between them walked their two children, Prince Henrik, who appeared to be about Alexander's age, and Princess Astrid, a girl of perhaps 10 years whose bright blue dress matched her sparkling eyes. King William stepped forward to greet the Nordland delegation with the formal warmth that characterized his diplomatic style. "Ambassador Nordstrom, Lady Nordstrom, welcome to Ashworth Palace. Your presence honors us on this special occasion." "Your Majesty," Ambassador Nordstrom replied with a deep bow, "the pleasure is entirely ours. Allow me to present my children, Prince Henrik and Princess Astrid." Alexander watched as the young Prince Henrik executed a perfect formal bow, his movements displaying the training that came from years of diplomatic protocol education. Princess Astrid curtsied with equal precision, her young face serious with concentration as she performed the complex greeting required when meeting foreign royalty. "Prince Alexander," King William said, placing his hand on his son's back, "I believe you and Prince Henrik share many common interests. Perhaps you would enjoy showing him some of our palace's historical collections before the formal ceremony begins." This suggestion aligned perfectly with traditional protocol and offered Alexander an opportunity to fulfill his diplomatic obligations while maintaining appropriate distance from Queen Isabella's manipulative schemes. However, before Alexander could respond, Queen Isabella appeared at their group as if summoned by some invisible signal. "Your Majesty," Queen Isabella said, directing her attention to Ambassador Nordstrom while offering a gracious smile, "I do hope your family will find today's celebrations to their liking. I have taken the liberty of arranging some special entertainment for the younger members of our gathering." Ambassador Nordstrom bowed respectfully to Queen Isabella. "Your Majesty is most kind. My children have been looking forward to this visit for weeks. Queen Isabella's smile broadened, and Alexander recognized the expression that typically preceded one of her carefully orchestrated social maneuvers. Prince Alexander has graciously volunteered to escort Princess Astrid during the garden reception, ensuring that she feels welcome and comfortable among our guests. The statement hung in the air like a challenge, and Alexander felt every eye in their immediate circle turned toward him. Ambassador Nordstrom looked pleased by what appeared to be a generous gesture from the royal family. Lady Nordstrom smiled warmly at Alexander, clearly interpreting Queen Isabella's announcement as evidence of thoughtful hospitality. Prince Henrik nodded approvingly, seemingly happy that his sister would have a companion during the formal proceedings. But Alexander knew that Queen Isabella had deliberately misrepresented both the nature of their earlier conversation and the extent of his agreement to her requests. By framing her manipulation as his voluntary offer, she had made it nearly impossible for him to object without appearing rude to their diplomatic guests and potentially embarrassing the royal family. King William's eyebrows rose slightly, a subtle sign of his surprise at this arrangement. Alexander realized that his father had not been consulted about these escort duties, despite Queen Isabella's earlier claims to the contrary. The king's confusion created an opening for Alexander to clarify the situation, but doing so in front of the Nordland delegation would risk creating an uncomfortable diplomatic incident. "I'm sure Prince Alexander would be honored to spend time with Princess Astrid," King William said diplomatically, though his tone carried a note of uncertainty that suggested he was improvising rather than confirming a predetermined arrangement. Princess Astrid looked up at Alexander with bright, expectant eyes. "I would very much enjoy seeing your gardens, Your Royal Highness. My mother has told me wonderful stories about the rose collection at Ashworth Palace." The innocence in her voice made Alexander's situation even more difficult. Princess Astrid was clearly excited about the prospect of having a royal guide during her family's visit, and disappointing her would seem cruel and unnecessary. Yet Alexander recognized that agreeing to Queen Isabella's arrangement would establish a dangerous precedent, encouraging her to make similar assumptions about his compliance with future schemes. Captain Thornton approached their group with measured steps, his presence offering a potential solution to Alexander's dilemma. "Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness," he said with a formal bow to King William and Queen Isabella, "I must respectfully request a brief consultation regarding today's security arrangements." "Certainly, Captain," King William replied. "What concerns require our attention?" Captain Thornton's expression remained professionally neutral, but Alexander noticed how the captain's eyes briefly met his own, as if communicating some unspoken understanding. "The increased security presence may require modifications to the planned movement patterns for members of the royal family during today's outdoor activities." Queen Isabella's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Surely these security considerations need not interfere with diplomatic hospitalities, Captain." "Of course not, Your Majesty," Captain Thornton replied smoothly. "However, I would recommend that any escorts or companions for our young guests be drawn from the specially trained palace guides, who are familiar with emergency protocols and evacuation procedures." This suggestion offered Alexander an elegant escape from Queen Isabella's manipulation while maintaining the diplomatic courtesy that Princess Astrid expected. Specially trained palace guides could provide Princess Astrid with an informative and entertaining tour without placing Alexander in the position of choosing between family loyalty and personal autonomy. However, Queen Isabella was not easily deterred from her objectives. "That seems unnecessarily formal, Captain. Prince Alexander is perfectly capable of ensuring Princess Astrid's safety and enjoyment during a simple garden walk." Ambassador Nordstrom intervened with the diplomatic skill that had earned him his prestigious position. "Your Majesties, please allow me to suggest that my children would be delighted with whatever arrangements you deem most appropriate. We are guests in your magnificent home, and we defer entirely to your judgment regarding protocol and security." His gracious response diffused the immediate tension while placing the decision squarely back in the hands of the royal family. Alexander realized that this moment represented a crucial test of his ability to assert himself diplomatically while respecting the complex web of relationships that governed palace life. Looking directly at Queen Isabella, Alexander made his choice. "Your Majesty, while I would normally be honored to serve as Princess Astrid's escort, I believe Captain Thornton's security recommendations should take precedence during today's events." The words came out more firmly than Alexander had intended, and the slight emphasis he placed on Your Majesty carried a formality that bordered on defiance. Queen Isabella's green eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or surprise, but she maintained her composed expression for the benefit of their diplomatic guests. "I see," Queen Isabella said slowly. "Perhaps we should discuss this matter further at a more appropriate time." King William stepped into the conversation with the authority of someone accustomed to resolving conflicts before they could escalate. I believe Prince Alexander's deference to security protocols demonstrates wisdom beyond his years. Captain Thornton, please arrange for our most experienced palace guides to assist with today's hospitality duties. Immediately, Your Majesty, Captain Thornton replied with evident relief. As the immediate crisis passed, Alexander felt a mixture of victory and apprehension. He had successfully avoided Queen Isabella's manipulation without creating a diplomatic incident, but he sensed that this confrontation was merely the opening move in a larger game. Queen Isabella's political instincts were too sharp for her to accept such a public rebuff without planning some form of retaliation. The conversation resumed its normal diplomatic rhythm as King William engaged Ambassador Nordstrom in discussions about trade agreements and cultural exchanges. Prince Henrik began asking Alexander about the historical artifacts displayed throughout the reception hall, showing genuine interest in the stories behind various paintings and sculptures. Princess Astrid chatted excitedly with one of the palace guides who had appeared to assume escort duties, her earlier disappointment forgotten in the face of professional hospitality. But Alexander remained acutely aware of Queen Isabella's presence at the edge of their group. She participated in the ongoing conversations with her usual charm and intelligence, but something in her manner suggested that she was already calculating her next move. The political chess game that governed palace life had entered a new phase, and Alexander realized that his successful resistance to her manipulation might have made him a more significant player than he had ever intended to become. As the formal ceremony approached and more diplomatic delegations arrived, Alexander found himself caught between competing emotions. Pride in his successful assertion of independence warred with anxiety about the potential consequences of defying Queen Isabella. The weight of royal responsibility pressed down on his shoulders, but for the first time in months, he felt like he had taken control of his own destiny rather than simply reacting to the political currents that swirled around him. The sound of the royal orchestra beginning the processional music signaled that the formal ceremony was about to commence, and Alexander knew that the real test of his newfound resolve was still to come. The formal ceremony unfolded with the precision of a military operation, each moment choreographed according to traditions that stretched back centuries. Alexander stood at his designated position beside his father, acutely aware of Queen Isabella's presence 3 steps to the left, where protocol dictated she should stand during state functions. The grand reception hall had filled with over 200 distinguished guests, including ambassadors from 12 nations, members of parliament, religious leaders, and representatives from the kingdom's most influential families. As King William delivered his ceremonial address celebrating 3 years of marriage to Queen Isabella and the strengthening of international alliances during that period, Alexander found himself studying the faces in the crowd. He recognized many of the guests from previous state functions, but today their expressions seemed different somehow, more attentive, as if they sensed undercurrents of tension that extended beyond the usual diplomatic complexities. Ambassador Nordstrom stood with his family in the front section reserved for honored guests, his weathered face displaying the polite attention that characterized career diplomats during formal ceremonies. Prince Henrik appeared genuinely interested in the proceedings, his young eyes taking in every detail of royal pageantry that he would likely encounter in his own future diplomatic career. Princess Astrid stood quietly beside the palace guide, who had been assigned to her care, occasionally whispering questions about the various ceremonial elements she was witnessing. Queen Isabella's response to the king's address was flawless in its execution, her gracious smile and perfectly timed acknowledgments demonstrating the political skills that had made her such an effective royal consort. Yet Alexander noticed subtle signs of tension in her posture, a slight stiffness in her shoulders that suggested she remained focused on matters beyond the immediate ceremony. As the formal presentations concluded and guests began moving toward the adjoining ballroom for the reception portion of the evening, Alexander hoped that the worst of the day's conflicts had passed. However, his relief proved premature when Queen Isabella approached him near the ornate doorway that separated the 2 great halls. "Alexander," she said quietly, positioning herself so that their conversation would not be easily overheard by passing guests, "I believe we need to address what occurred earlier today." "Your Majesty," Alexander replied, maintaining the formal tone that seemed appropriate given the public setting and the unresolved tension between them. Queen Isabella's green eyes studied his face carefully, as if searching for signs of weakness or uncertainty that she could exploit. "You seem to have forgotten that royal duty sometimes requires personal sacrifice. Today's events were carefully arranged to strengthen our diplomatic relationships, and your unwillingness to participate fully has created unnecessary complications." Alexander felt his chest tighten with a combination of frustration and determination. Your Majesty, I believe I fulfilled my diplomatic obligations appropriately while respecting necessary security protocols. Security protocols, Queen Isabella repeated, her voice carrying a note of skepticism. How convenient that Captain Thornton appeared precisely when you needed an excuse to avoid your commitments. The implication in her words stung Alexander more than he had expected. Queen Isabella was suggesting that he had somehow collaborated with Captain Thornton to undermine her authority, an accusation that felt both unfair and politically dangerous. If other members of the royal household began to suspect that Alexander was working with palace security to circumvent Queen Isabella's instructions, it could create divisions that would weaken the entire institution. Captain Thornton was acting on security intelligence and direct orders from my father, Alexander said, his voice rising slightly despite his efforts to remain calm. I would never compromise the safety of our guests or the integrity of palace security for personal reasons. Queen Isabella stepped closer, her proximity making their conversation feel more intimate and therefore more threatening. Your personal reasons seem to be precisely the problem, Alexander. You appear to believe that your preferences should override diplomatic necessities and family obligations. The accusation felt deeply unfair to Alexander, who had spent his entire life learning to subordinate personal desires to royal duty. His resistance to Queen Isabella's manipulation was not based on selfish motives, but on his growing recognition that she was using her position to advance personal agendas that might not align with the best interests of the kingdom or the royal family. I believe my obligations are to the crown and to my father, Alexander replied, his voice carrying more firmness than he had intended. Not to arrangements made without consultation or consent. Queen Isabella's expression hardened, and for a moment the carefully maintained facade of royal composure slipped slightly. Your obligations, young prince, are whatever I determine them to be when your father is not present to supervise your behavior. The claim was both shocking and revealing. Queen Isabella was asserting a level of authority over Alexander that extended far beyond her official role as his stepmother or her position as queen consort. She was claiming the right to make decisions about his activities, commitments, and responsibilities without consulting either Alexander himself or King William. Alexander felt something inside him rebel against this assertion of control. Throughout his 12 years, he had accepted countless restrictions, obligations, and sacrifices as natural consequences of his royal birth. He had endured hours of protocol training, diplomatic education, and ceremonial preparation without complaint. He had learned to speak multiple languages, master complex social interactions, and navigate political situations that would challenge most adults. But Queen Isabella's claim that she could determine his obligations unilaterally, without consultation or consent, represented a line that Alexander was not willing to cross. The realization that she viewed him as a tool to be manipulated, rather than a family member to be guided, filled him with a determination that surprised him with its intensity. Your Majesty, Alexander said, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart, I respectfully disagree with that interpretation of royal authority in family relationships. The words hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. Queen Isabella's eyes widened slightly, as if she had not expected Alexander to assert himself so directly. Around them, the reception continued with its usual blend of diplomatic conversation and social pleasantries. But the space immediately surrounding Alexander and Queen Isabella seemed to exist in a bubble of tense silence. I see, Queen Isabella said slowly, her voice taking on a dangerous quality that Alexander had never heard before. Perhaps you need a clearer understanding of your position in this family and in this kingdom. Before Alexander could respond, Queen Isabella raised her hand as if preparing to deliver some form of physical correction to his defiant attitude. The gesture was subtle enough that casual observers might have interpreted it as an emphatic gesture accompanying her words, but Alexander recognized the threatening intent behind the movement. In that instant, Captain Thornton appeared beside them with the swift, silent approach that characterized elite palace security personnel. His presence was not coincidental. Alexander realized that the captain had been monitoring their interaction from a discreet distance, ready to intervene if the situation escalated beyond verbal disagreement. Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, Captain Thornton said with a slight bow that acknowledged both their ranks while positioning himself between them. His Majesty the King has requested Prince Alexander's presence in the Blue Drawing Room for a brief consultation with the Nordland delegation. The interruption provided both Alexander and Queen Isabella with an opportunity to step back from their confrontation without losing face in front of the reception guests. However, Queen Isabella's expression suggested that she viewed Captain Thornton's intervention as further evidence of conspiracy against her authority. Of course, Queen Isabella said, her voice returning to its usual controlled politeness. Prince Alexander should not keep his father waiting. As Alexander moved toward the blue drawing room, escorted by Captain Thornton, he felt the weight of Queen Isabella's gaze following him across the reception hall. He realized that their confrontation had reached a point where reconciliation might no longer be possible. The careful balance of relationships that governed palace life had been disrupted, and the consequences would likely extend far beyond this single afternoon. Captain Thornton walked silently beside Alexander until they were well away from the main reception area, then spoke in a low voice that would not carry to other ears. "Your Royal Highness, I believe it would be wise to remain close to your father or other trusted advisors for the remainder of today's events." The captain's words confirmed Alexander's suspicion that Queen Isabella's behavior had crossed lines that concerned palace security. Captain Thornton had dedicated his career to protecting the royal family, and his protective instincts were clearly focused on Alexander in this moment. "Thank you, Captain," Alexander replied, grateful for the support but also sobered by the realization that he might need protection from a member of his own family. As they approached the blue drawing room, Alexander could hear his father's voice, engaged in friendly conversation with Ambassador Nordstrom about cultural exchange programs between their kingdoms. The normal pleasant sounds of diplomatic discussion offered a stark contrast to the tension that had characterized his interaction with Queen Isabella. Alexander paused at the threshold of the drawing room, looking back toward the reception hall where Queen Isabella continued to charm guests and maintain her role as the perfect royal hostess. From this distance she appeared every inch the elegant, accomplished queen that the public admired and respected. But Alexander now understood that beneath that polished exterior lay a political mind that viewed him not as family, but as an obstacle to be managed or manipulated according to her strategic objectives. The realization filled him with a mixture of sadness and determination. His relationship with Queen Isabella might be irreparably damaged, but he had learned something crucial about himself in the process of standing up to her manipulation. He possessed the strength and conviction necessary to defend his principles, even when doing so required challenging the most powerful people in his world. As Alexander entered the blue drawing room to join his father in the Nordland delegation, he carried with him the knowledge that the political landscape of his life had changed forever. The confrontation with Queen Isabella had revealed truths about power, manipulation, and personal autonomy that would shape his approach to royal duty for years to come. The conversation in the blue drawing room provided Alexander with a welcome respite from the tension that had characterized his earlier interactions with Queen Isabella. King William was engaged in a detailed discussion with Ambassador Nordstrom about establishing a student exchange program between their kingdoms, while Prince Henrik listened with obvious interest to the educational opportunities being described. The atmosphere was warm and collegial. "Alexander," King William said as his son entered the room, "Ambassador Nordstrom was just telling me about the exceptional maritime academy in his homeland. Prince Henrik has been attending classes there, and their curriculum sounds quite impressive." Alexander joined the conversation gratefully, finding genuine interest in Prince Henrik's descriptions of advanced navigation techniques and naval history studies. For nearly an hour, they discussed academic pursuits, shared interests in historical research, and the challenges of balancing royal obligations with personal intellectual development. The normal, friendly interaction helped Alexander regain his emotional equilibrium after the disturbing confrontation with Queen Isabella. However, their peaceful interlude was interrupted when James, Alexander's valet, entered the drawing room with an expression of barely concealed concern. His usual composure had been replaced by the tight-lipped tension that palace staff displayed when they carried unwelcome news. "Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness," James said, bowing respectfully to King William and Alexander, "Queen Isabella has requested that Prince Alexander return to the reception hall immediately. We wishes to present him to the ambassador from Westshire, who has apparently expressed particular interest in meeting the heir to the throne." Alexander felt his stomach clench with apprehension. Queen Isabella's request carried the tone of a royal command, but the timing and circumstances made it feel more like a summons to further confrontation. The mention of the ambassador from Westshire added a diplomatic dimension that would make resistance appear disrespectful to their international guests. King William frowned slightly, clearly puzzled by the urgency of Queen Isabella's request. "Did the Queen indicate why this presentation requires immediate attention, James?" Ambassador Westshire was scheduled to be introduced to Alexander during tomorrow morning's formal audience. "No specific explanation was provided, Your Majesty," James replied carefully. However, Queen Isabella emphasized that the matter was time-sensitive and required Prince Alexander's immediate presence. The valet's diplomatic language could not entirely conceal his discomfort with delivering this message. Alexander realized that James, who had served the royal family for decades, recognized the unusual nature of Queen Isabella's request and was concerned about the implications for Alexander's well-being. Ambassador Nordstrom tactfully excused himself and Prince Henrik from the conversation, recognizing that royal family matters required privacy. Your Majesty, Prince Alexander, thank you for a most enlightening discussion. We look forward to continuing our conversations tomorrow. As the Nordland delegation departed, King William turned to Alexander with the expression that mixed paternal concern with royal authority. Alexander, is there something about today's events that you need to discuss with me? The direct question presented Alexander with an opportunity to explain the full extent of his conflicts with Queen Isabella, but he hesitated. Describing Queen Isabella's manipulative behavior to his father would require Alexander to acknowledge tensions within the royal family that could have serious political implications. If King William felt compelled to choose sides in the conflict, the resulting divisions could damage the monarchy's public image and internal stability. Father, Alexander said carefully, I believe Queen Isabella and I have different perspectives on my role in today's diplomatic activities. King William's steel-blue eyes studied his son's face intently, clearly recognizing that this diplomatic language concealed more significant concerns. Different perspectives about what, specifically? Alexander took a deep breath, realizing that honesty was the only path forward that preserved both his integrity and his relationship with his father. Queen Isabella has been making commitments and arrangements on my behalf without consulting me or you. When I attempted to clarify my actual obligations, she became quite insistent about her authority to determine my activities. The king's expression grew more serious as he processed this information. What sort of commitments and arrangements? Escort duties for diplomatic guests, participation in events that conflict with established protocol, and social obligations that she claims were authorized by you but which you never actually approved. King William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a sign of rising anger that Alexander had learned to recognize over the years. The king's protective instincts regarding his son were strong, and the suggestion that Queen Isabella was manipulating Alexander while falsely claiming royal authorization was clearly troubling to him. I see, King William said quietly. And how did Queen Isabella respond when you questioned these arrangements? Alexander hesitated again, uncertain how much detail to provide about Queen Isabella's threatening behavior and assertions of absolute authority over him. He was not pleased with my resistance to her instructions. The careful phrasing conveyed enough information to alert King William to the seriousness of the situation, without providing inflammatory details that might escalate family conflicts beyond repair. However, Alexander's diplomatic language did not fool his father, whose political instincts were highly developed after years of ruling a complex modern monarchy. Alexander, King William said firmly, I need you to understand that no one, regardless of their position in this family or this kingdom, has the authority to make commitments on your behalf without consulting both you and me. Your cooperation with royal obligations is expected, but those obligations must be legitimate and properly authorized. The clear statement of principle provided Alexander with enormous relief, confirming that his resistance to Queen Isabella's manipulation had been justified. However, he realized that King William's support also placed both of them in a difficult position regarding future interactions with Queen Isabella. Before Alexander could respond, the drawing room door opened again, and Queen Isabella herself entered, with determined strides. Her earlier facade of pleasant royal composure had been replaced by an expression of barely contained frustration that made Alexander instinctively step closer to his father. William, Queen Isabella said, her accent becoming more pronounced as it typically did when she was agitated. I must speak with you about Alexander's behavior today. King William's posture straightened, and Alexander recognized the subtle shift that indicated his father was transitioning into his role as sovereign rather than husband. Isabella, I understand that there have been some misunderstandings about Alexander's obligations today. Misunderstandings? Queen Isabella's voice rose slightly before she caught herself and resumed a more controlled tone. Alexander has been openly defiant and disrespectful throughout today's events. He has refused to fulfill diplomatic commitments, contradicted my instructions in front of international guests, and generally behaved in a manner that reflects poorly on our family. The accusations hung in the air like a formal indictment, and Alexander felt the weight of Queen Isabella's political skills being brought to bear against him. She had framed his resistance to her manipulation as evidence of disrespectful behavior and diplomatic incompetence, positions that would be difficult for him to refute without appearing to make excuses. However, King William's response surprised both Alexander and Queen Isabella with its firmness. And Queen Isabella, what specific diplomatic commitments did Alexander refuse to fulfill? The direct question caught Queen Isabella off guard, and Alexander could see her calculating how much detail to provide without revealing the extent of her unauthorized arrangements. He refused to escort Princess Astrid during the garden reception Despite my explanation that this gesture would strengthen our relationship with the Nordland delegation, I was not consulted about any escort arrangements, King William said calmly. When were these commitments made and under whose authority? Queen Isabella's cheeks flushed slightly, a sign of embarrassment or anger that she rarely displayed in public. I assumed that you would approve of any reasonable diplomatic courtesy that strengthened our international relationships. You assumed incorrectly, King William replied with quiet authority. All commitments involving Alexander require my explicit approval, and all diplomatic arrangements must be coordinated through proper palace channels. The rebuke was delivered in King William's characteristic diplomatic style, but its meaning was unmistakable. Queen Isabella had overstepped her authority, and her assumptions about her role in managing Alexander's activities were incorrect. The formal correction from the king represented a public acknowledgement that Alexander's resistance had been justified. Queen Isabella's expression shifted as she realized that King William was supporting his son's position rather than automatically deferring to her judgment. William, surely you understand that effective royal management sometimes requires flexibility and quick decision-making. I understand that effective royal management requires proper authorization and clear communication, King William replied. Alexander's obligations to the crown are significant, but they must be legitimate obligations established through appropriate channels. Alexander felt a surge of gratitude toward his father, whose clear support provided him with the confidence to address Queen Isabella directly. Your Majesty, I am always willing to fulfill my royal duties, but I believe those duties should be clearly defined and properly authorized. Queen Isabella's green eyes flashed with something that looked like fury, but she maintained enough composure to avoid creating a scene that would echo beyond the drawing room walls. I see that you have successfully turned your father against me, Alexander. How very clever of you. The accusation was both unfair and revealing. Queen Isabella was framing King William's support for proper protocol as evidence of manipulation by Alexander, suggesting that she viewed family relationships through the lens of political competition rather than mutual respect and affection. King William's voice carried a warning tone that Alexander had rarely heard directed toward any member of the royal family. Isabella, this conversation has gone quite far enough. Alexander has demonstrated appropriate respect for both royal protocol and family relationships. Any future arrangements involving him will be discussed with me in advance. The firmness of the king's statement made it clear that Queen Isabella's authority over Alexander had been significantly curtailed. But Alexander realized that this victory might come at the cost of permanently damaging his relationship with his stepmother. The political implications of such family divisions could extend far beyond personal relationships, affecting the stability and public image of the entire monarchy. The tension in the blue drawing room stretched like a taut wire as Queen Isabella absorbed the full impact of King William's rebuke. For several long moments, the only sound was the distant murmur of conversation from the reception hall, where guests continued their diplomatic socializing, unaware of the family drama unfolding behind closed doors. Alexander watched his stepmother's face cycle through various emotions: anger, disappointment, calculation, and finally a cold acceptance that chilled him more than her earlier fury had. Very well, William, Queen Isabella said finally, her voice carrying a formal distance that had not been present in their interactions before this day. I understand your position perfectly. In future, I shall ensure that all matters concerning Alexander are directed to your attention rather than attempting to provide guidance myself. The words were technically respectful, but their tone conveyed a withdrawal that felt more like a strategic retreat than genuine acceptance. Alexander realized that Queen Isabella was not conceding the legitimacy of his resistance, but rather acknowledging that she lacked the political power to override King William's support for his son. The distinction was important because it suggested that her fundamental view of their relationship had not changed, only her tactics for managing it. King William seemed to recognize this as well, because his response carried the weight of formal royal decree rather than familial discussion.
Isabella, I want to be absolutely clear about expectations going forward.
Alexander is my heir and my son, and his development into his future role requires careful guidance and appropriate boundaries. Any attempts to circumvent established protocols or make unauthorized commitments on his behalf will be considered a serious breach of royal procedure. The formal language served multiple purposes. It established clear guidelines for future interactions, it protected Alexander from further manipulation, and it created an official record of royal policy that could not be easily disputed or reinterpreted later. Alexander felt immense gratitude for his father's political skill in handling this delicate situation. But he also understood that the formal nature of the decree reflected the seriousness of the breach that had occurred. Queen Isabella's response was equally formal. indicating that she understood the conversation had moved beyond family disagreement into the realm of official royal policy. Your Majesty's instructions are perfectly clear, and they will be followed without exception. The use of Your Majesty rather than William marked a fundamental shift in the dynamic between King William and Queen Isabella, at least regarding matters involving Alexander. What had begun as a family dispute had evolved into a constitutional question about authority, responsibility, and the proper roles of various members of the royal household. As this exchange concluded, Captain Thornton appeared in the doorway, with the discreet timing that characterized experienced palace security personnel. Your Majesty, the reception guests are beginning to inquire about your presence for the closing ceremonies. The reminder provided everyone with an opportunity to transition back to their public roles. But Alexander sensed that the relationships within the royal family had been permanently altered by the day's events. Queen Isabella's political abilities would ensure that she continued to fulfill her public duties with grace and effectiveness, but her private interactions with Alexander would likely remain cool and formal for the foreseeable future. "Thank you, Captain," King William replied. "We'll rejoin our guests immediately." As they prepared to leave the blue drawing room, King William placed his hand on Alexander's shoulder in a gesture that was both paternal and protective. "Alexander, I want you to remember that royal duty includes the obligation to speak honestly about situations that concern you. Your behavior today demonstrated maturity and integrity." The praise meant more to Alexander than any formal recognition or ceremonial honor could have. His father's acknowledgement that he had handled a difficult situation appropriately provided validation for choices that had required considerable courage and determination. More importantly, it established a precedent for future interactions that would protect him from similar manipulation. Queen Isabella walked slightly ahead of them as they returned to the reception hall, her posture perfect and her expression composed in preparation for resuming her public role. However, Alexander noticed a subtle change in her bearing that suggested the day's events had affected her as well. The confident assumption of authority that had characterized her earlier behavior had been replaced by a more cautious awareness of boundaries and limitations. The reception hall buzzed with the elevated energy that typically marked the conclusion of successful diplomatic events. Guests clustered in animated conversation groups, exchanging contact information and making plans for future cultural exchanges. Ambassador Nordstrom was deep in discussion with several other diplomatic representatives about coordinating educational programs, while Prince Henrik and Princess Astrid excitedly compared notes about the palace tour they had enjoyed with the professional guides. As the royal family returned to their hosting duties, Alexander marveled at how seamlessly they all transitioned back into their public personas. King William resumed his role as the gracious sovereign, engaging guests in conversations that balanced warmth with appropriate formality. Queen Isabella displayed her characteristic charm and intelligence, making each guest feel valued and appreciated. To casual observers, the royal family appeared to function with perfect harmony and mutual support. But Alexander now understood that the public performance of royal unity required constant negotiation of private boundaries and relationships. The conflicts that had erupted today had been resolved through clear establishment of authority and responsibility, but the underlying tensions that had created those conflicts would likely persist beneath the surface of family interactions. Ambassador Nordstrom approached Alexander during the final hour of the reception, with a warm smile that indicated his positive impression of the day's events. "Your Royal Highness, I want to thank you for the wonderful hospitality my family has experienced today. Prince Henrik has been particularly impressed with your knowledge of naval history, and Princess Astrid hasn't stopped talking about the magnificent gardens and the excellent guidance she received from your palace staff." "It has been our pleasure, Ambassador," Alexander replied, genuinely pleased that the diplomatic objectives of the day had been achieved despite the personal conflicts that had occurred behind the scenes. "I hope this visit strengthens the friendship between our kingdoms." "I have no doubt that it will," Ambassador Nordstrom said. "Your father and Queen Isabella have created an atmosphere of welcome that makes international cooperation feel both natural and necessary." The ambassador's praise for Queen Isabella reminded Alexander that her political skills and diplomatic effectiveness remained valuable assets to the kingdom. Her ability to charm international guests and advance the kingdom's interests through cultural diplomacy was genuine and important, even if her approach to family relationships left much to be desired. As the reception concluded and guests began taking their formal leave, Alexander reflected on the lessons he had learned during this challenging day. Standing up for his principles had required courage, but it had also required support from allies like Captain Thornton and his father. Royal duty involved more than simply following instructions. It required the wisdom to distinguish between legitimate obligations and personal manipulation, and the strength to resist the latter even when doing so created uncomfortable conflicts. The evening's closing ceremonies proceeded with traditional precision, culminating in the formal toast that celebrated the strengthening of international friendships and the continuation of diplomatic cooperation. Alexander stood beside his father during this ceremony, acutely aware that his position there represented more than ceremonial protocol. It symbolized his relationship with the crown, his future responsibilities, and his growing maturity as a member of the royal family. Queen Isabella delivered a gracious closing address that thanked all the guests for their presence and emphasized the importance of cultural exchange in building lasting international relationships. Her speech was flawless in its execution, demonstrating the political skills that had made her such an effective royal consort. However, Alexander noticed that her eyes never met his during her remarks, a subtle indication that their relationship had indeed been fundamentally altered by the day's events. As the last guests departed and the palace staff began the extensive process of restoring the grand reception hall to its normal state, Alexander found himself alone with his thoughts for the first time all day. The ornate room, which had been filled with hundreds of people just hours earlier, now felt vast and quiet, its elegant decorations reflecting the soft light of the remaining candles. Captain Thornton approached as Alexander stood contemplating the day's events. "Your Royal Highness, if I may say so, you handled today's challenges with remarkable composure." "Thank you, Captain," Alexander replied. "I appreciate your support throughout the day."
Captain Thornton nodded gravely.
"Protecting the royal family sometimes involves more than physical security, Your Royal Highness. Today's events reminded me that wisdom and integrity are just as important as courage in fulfilling royal obligations." As Alexander made his way to his private chambers that evening, he carried with him a new understanding of his place within the complex ecosystem of royal life. The conflicts with Queen Isabella had been resolved through the establishment of clear boundaries and proper authority structures, but they had also taught him valuable lessons about political maneuvering, family dynamics, and personal integrity. The 12-year-old prince who had awakened that morning, uncertain about his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of palace politics, had been transformed by necessity into someone who understood that royal duties sometimes required challenging those in positions of power. It was a lesson that would serve him well in the years to come. As he continued his development toward eventually assuming the throne himself, looking out the window of his chamber toward the palace gardens where tomorrow's diplomatic meetings would continue, Alexander realized that this day had marked a turning point in his life. He had discovered strengths he didn't know he possessed, established relationships of mutual respect with important allies, and learned to distinguish between legitimate authority and personal manipulation. Most importantly, he had proven to himself that maintaining personal integrity was possible even within the complex political environment of royal life. The anniversary celebration that had begun as Queen Isabella's political showcase had instead become Alexander's declaration of independence, setting the stage for a future in which he would approach royal obligations with both wisdom and strength.